Goblin Tales of Lancashire by James Bowker, narrated by Malc Cowle. The Fairy Funeral. There are few spots in Lancashire more likely to have been peopled by fairies than that portion of the highway which runs along the end of Penwortham Wood. At all times the locality is very beautiful, but it is especially so in summer, when the thin line of trees on the one side of the road and the rustling wood upon the other cast a welcome shade upon the traveller, who can rest against the old railings and look down upon a rich expanse of meadowland and cornfields, bounded in the distance by dim, solemn-looking hills, and over the white farmhouses, snugly set in the midst of luxurious vegetation. From this vantage point a flight of steps leads down to the well of St. Mary, the water of which, once renowned for its miraculous efficacy, is as clear as crystal and of never-ceasing flow. To this sacred neighbourhood thousands of pilgrims have wended their way, and although the legend of the Holy Well has been lost, it is easy to understand with what superstitious reverence the place would be approached by those whose faith was of a devout and unquestioning kind, and what feelings would influence those whose hearts were heavy with the weight of a great sorrow as they descended the steps worn by the feet of their countless predecessors. From the little spring a pathway winds across meadows and through cornfields to the sheltered village, and a little further along the highway a beautiful avenue winds from the old lodge gates to the ancient church and priory. Wide as is this road, it is more than shaded by the tall trees, which tower on each side, their topmost branches almost interlaced. The sunbeams passing through the green network and throwing fantastic gleams of light upon the pathway, along which so many have been carried to the quiet God's acre. At the end of this long and beautiful walk stands the old priory, no longer occupied by the Benedictines from Evesham, the silvery sound of whose voices at eventide used to swell across the rippling Ribble, and a little to the right of the pile the church of St. Mary, with its background of the Castle Hill. By the foot of this ancient British and Roman outlook there is a little farmhouse, with meadowland stretching away to the broad river, and one night, 50 or 60 years ago, two men, one of whom was a local cow doctor, whose duties had compelled him to remain until a late hour, set out from this dwelling to walk home to the straggling village of Longton. It was near upon midnight when they stepped forth, but it was as light as midday, the moon shining in all her beauty and casting her glamour upon the peaceful scene. So quiet was it that it seemed as though even the zephyrs were asleep. There was not a breath of wind, and not a leaf rustled or a blade of grass stirred, and had it not been for the sounds of the footsteps of the two men, who were rapidly ascending the rough cart track winding up the side of the hill, all would have been as still as death. The sweet silence was a fitting one, for in the graveyard by the side of the lane through which the travellers were passing, and over the low moss-covered wall of which might be seen the old-fashioned tombstones, erect like so many sentinels marking the confines of the battlefield of life, hundreds were sleeping the sleep with which only the music of the leaves, the sough of the wind, and the sigh of the sea seem in harmony. As the two men opened the gate at the corner of the churchyard, the old clock sounded the first stroke of midnight. "That's 12 on 'em," said the oldest of the two. "Aye, Adam," said the other, a taller and much younger man. "Another day's passing away, and it can't do without telling everybody. Yet there's but few on us as takes any notice on it, for we cannot do to be told as our time's growing too short. I should think as thou doesn't care to hear the clock strike, Adam, to judge by colour of thy topping, for thou'rt getting very wintry looking." The old man chuckled at this sally, and then said slowly and dryly, "Speak for thysen, Robin, speak for thysen. And yet, why should to speak at all, child as thou? And thou'rt nobbut a child, clever as the fancies they send. Thou'rt old enough to mind as it's not always the grey-headed uns as dees the first. The chickens fall off the perch more oftener than the outbreds. There's mony an old tree, with but a 2-3 buds o' green about it, to show as it were young once, as that have hard work to delve up, the roots being so deep in ground. And there's many a rook o' young-looking uns, as they might pull up as easy as a handful o' salad. It takes lightning to kill thowd oak, but the first nipping wind off the march yon soon puts bonny spring posies out o' seat. If I'm growing old, let's hope I'm ripening as well. Thou'rt not the first bit of a lad as thought he were bound to last all t'others out, and has hardly time to finish his crowing afore the sexton clapped on full of sond in his mouth." This conversation brought the two beyond the gate, and some distance along the avenue, in which the moonlight was somewhat toned by the thickness of the foliage above, and they were rapidly nearing the lodge gates, when suddenly the solemn sound of a deep-toned bell broke the silence. Both men stopped and listened intently. "That's the passing bell," said Adam. "Whatever can be up? I never knew it rung at this time at night afore." "Make less racket, Wilter," said Robin. "Let's keep count and see how old it is." Whilst the bell chimed 6 and 20, both listeners stood almost breathless, and then Adam said, "He's thy age, Robin. Choose who he is." "There were no lights in the belfry as we come by, as I see on," said the young man. "I'd rather be in bed nor up there, towelling out this time, wouldn't tha?" "Yoi," said Adam, "but our Jemmy doesn't care, and why should he? He's been among deed too long to be fretting on 'em neat a day. Weak and fable as he is, I dare say he's fun out afore now, as they're not very rough to deal with. There's not much fighting in their burying holes, 'bout it's with the resurrectioners. But let's get to our home, lad. We're likely enough to learn all about it to-morn." Without more words they approached the lodge, but to their great terror, when they were within a few yards from the little dwelling, the gates noiselessly swung open, the doleful tolling of the passing bell being the only sound to be heard. Both men stepped back, affrighted, as a little figure clad in raiment of a dark hue, but wearing a bright red cap, and chanting some mysterious words in a low musical voice as he walked, stepped into the avenue. "Stomp back, mon," cried Adam in a terrified voice. "Stomp back. It's the fearing, but they'll not hurt thee if they doesna meddle with 'em." The young man forthwith obeyed his aged companion, and standing together against the trunk of a large tree, they gazed at the miniature being, stepping so lightly over the road, mottled by the stray moonbeams. It was a dainty little object, but although neither Adam nor Robin could comprehend the burden of the song it sang, the unmistakable croon of grief with which each stave ended told the listeners that the fairy was singing a requiem. The men kept perfectly silent, and in a little while the figure paused and turned round, as though in expectation, continuing, however, its mournful notes. By and by the voices of other singers were distinguished, and as they grew louder, the fairy standing in the roadway ceased to render the verse, and sang only the refrain, and a few minutes afterwards, Adam and Robin saw a marvellous cavalcade pass through the gateway. A number of figures, closely resembling the one to which their attention had first been drawn, walked 2 by 2, and behind them others with their caps in their hands, bore a little black coffin, the lid of which was drawn down so as to leave a portion of the contents uncovered. Behind these again others, walking in pairs, completed the procession. All were singing in inexpressibly mournful tones, pausing at regular intervals to allow the voice of the one in advance to be heard as it chanted the refrain of the song, and when the last couple had passed into the avenue, the gates closed as noiselessly as they had opened. As the bearers of the burden marched past the two watchers, Adam bent down, and by the help of a stray gleam of moonlight, saw that there was a little corpse in the coffin. "Robin, me lad," said he in a trembling voice and with a scared look, "it's the picture of thee as they have in that coffin." With a gasp of terror, the young man also stooped towards the bearers, and saw clearly enough that the face of the figure borne by the fairies indeed closely resembled his own, save that it was ghastly with the pallor and dews of death. The procession had passed ere he was able to speak, for already much affrighted by the appearance of the fairies, the sight of the little corpse had quite unnerved him. Clinging in a terrified manner to the old man, he said in a broken voice, "It really were me, Adam. Dost think it's a warning, and I'm about to die?" The old man stepped out into the road as he replied, "It were a queer sight, Robin, no doubt, but I've seen many such in me time, and they han come to naught in th' end. Warning or not, however," he added, with strong common sense, "there'll be no harm done by the living as if it were one." The mournful music of the strange singers and the solemn sound of the passing bell could still be heard, and the two awe-stricken men stood gazing after the cavalcade. "It mun be a warning," again said Robin, "and I wish I'd asked 'em how soon I'm to die. Maybe they hadna told me." "I don't think they would," said Adam. "I've always heard as they're rare and vexed if they spaken to. They happen had done the some lumberman if they'd asked out." "They could but ha' killed me," replied Robin, adding, with that grim humour which so often accompanies despair, "and they're burying me now, are not they?" Then in a calm and firm voice he said, "I'm bound to ask 'em, come what will. If thou'rt frightened, they can go on whome." "Nay, nay," said Adam warmly, "I'm noant scared. If thou'rt for catechising 'em, I'll see th' end on it." Without further parley the men followed, and soon overtook the procession, which was just about to enter the old churchyard, the gates of which, like those of the lodge, swung open apparently of their own accord. And no sooner did Robin come up with the bearers than, in a trembling voice, he cried, "When you tell me how long I've to live?" There was not any answer to this appeal, the little figure in front continuing to chant its refrain with even deepened mournfulness. Imagining that he was the leader of the band, Robin stretched out his hand and touched him. No sooner had he done this, than with startling suddenness the old cavalcade vanished. The gates banged to with a loud clang. Deep darkness fell upon everything. The wind howled and moaned around the church and the tombstones in the graveyard. The branches creaked and groaned overhead. Drops of rain pattered upon the leaves. Mutterings of thunder were heard, and a lurid flash of lightning quivered down the gloomy avenue. "I told her I be," said Adam, and Robin simply answered, "I'm no worse off than before. Let's march towards Wome, but say nowt to our folk. It had nibbit frightened the women." Before the two men reached the lodge gates, a terrible storm burst over them, and through it they made their way to the distant village. A great change came over Robin, and from being the foremost in every countryside Malc, he became serious and reserved, invariably at the close of the day's work rambling away as though anxious to shun mankind, or else spending the evening at Adam's, talking over the warning. Strange to say, about a month afterwards he fell from a haystack, and after lingering some time, during which he often deliriously rambled about the events of the dreadful night, he dozed away. Old Jemmy, the sexton, had another grave to open, and the grey-headed Adam was one of the bearers who carried Robin's corpse along the avenue, in which they had so short a time before seen the fairy funeral.